mentioned previously that the scientific approach includes description, prediction, and understanding. So psychology takes a scientific approach to research, often using empirical or experimental methods to understand the phenomena of interest. So we want to describe, summarize data, produce it in a way that makes events and the relationships between them easily understandable. So we want it to be understandable and want to describe it well. We want it to predict, so using the outcome of the research to identify what is likely to occur in the future. And we want to understand, so identifying the causal factors that lead to the results found. We're going to have a look at the elements of an experiment. Experiments ask whether systematic variation in one variable produces variation in another. So this is our independent variables, so that manipulation by the experimenter. So that's the variation, the systematic variation of the IV. And we have the dependent variable, so the participant's response, so the outcome. Experiments investigate the effect of the IV on the DV. So if we look at our independent variable here, the administration of the drug, and what our dependent variable is the impact of the drug on physical appearance. So we have two people, we have twin A and twin B, and you can see that one of them has been given a drug. And we want to see if that drug has an effect on physical appearance. So we've manipulated here by giving the administration of the drug to twin B and no drug to twin A. And we can see here that the outcome is that it does have an effect on physical appearance. So this is one way that we can look at systematic variation. Here, have a think about, so another way we might look at it is the IV. So in the previous example, we had the IV where we had drug or no drug, but we can also administer different dosage of the drug. So we can have small amount or large amount and see if that impacts on physical appearance. So you can see that we have independent variable, which is, we're using the same variable, which is a drug. The first one we have drug, no drug, and here we can have small dose, large dose. So we can see here that we can manipulate that independent variable while the dependent variable stays consistent. So we're looking at physical appearance again. So here does a small dose have a same or similar effect or a smaller effect than giving a person a large dose of the same drug. And we can see here in the outcome that twin A, who had the smaller drug, has a smaller effect. He's a bit shorter than twin B, who had the large drug. Another way we can control it is by administering a placebo. So within experimental research, it's good to have a control. One of the things that might be happening in those previous examples is that the participants might be expecting to have an effect on physical appearance, so it's impacting the outcome. So we can give somebody a placebo or a fake condition to see if it's just a placebo effect. Is it an actual effect of the drug, or is it just some psychological thing that's influencing it? So here we give twin A the placebo drug, so this drug shouldn't have an effect, or we give twin B the large dose of the drug again. And we find that twin A had no effect and twin B did have an effect on their physical appearance. So we can probably conclude from these results that the drug is having an effect on physical appearance, even when we control for things like placebo effects. Here we have an overview of the experimental research design. First we have step one, which is framing a hypothesis. So this should be based on theory, and from that theory we have a prediction about the relationship between two or more variables. Then we need to operationalize the variables. So this is converting abstract concepts into testable form. So if we want to measure something like depression, we need to be able to measure it, we need to operationalize it. So we might use something like the DASS that I mentioned before, which is the Depression Anxiety Stress Scale, to measure something like depression. So that's operationalizing depression by using a measure to test. Then we need to develop a standardized procedure. So some experimental and control conditions like we just mentioned. Selecting participants. So that sampling from the population, so random assignment, getting a representative sample. Then we need to apply statistical techniques to the data. So describe the data and determine the likelihood that differences between conditions reflect causality or chance, and drawing conclusions from those results. So what are the limits of experimental research? Complex real-world issues are not easily studied in the laboratory. So for example, things like prejudice, we can't look at that very well in a lab. So in many situations, the IV can't be manipulated. So this is quite common in psychology, where we can't actually manipulate a specific variable, either because it's just impossible or it's highly unethical to do so. So you can't make participants divorce to study the effects on children. It's not ethical to do that. And participants are likely not to do it for you either. So what we need to do is study groups that already exist. So what this means is, in psychology, we have a lot of quasi-experimental designs. This might include things like gender or sex, where we can't directly assign or randomly assign participants to a male group or a female group. It's something that's already existing, and we can't randomly assign people to that. So if we're looking at male, female, then we have a quasi-experimental design. So you can see here that this person is saying, what do you mean I can't be randomly assigned to the superhero group? It's because it's something's fixed, so we can't directly manipulate it. We can't make you a superhero, so we need to have those two different quasi-groups. If we look at something like laboratory studies that have problems with external validity. So like I mentioned before, external validity is the extent to which the findings of a study can be generalized to situations outside of the lab. So how closely does it reflect its real life counterpart? On the left is an actual experiment that was conducted in the 70s. I think it's called the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was conducted by Zimbardo. You can look that up on YouTube. But how closely did that reflect the actual world? And recently it's come out that perhaps it wasn't, that there was probably a lot more control going on around what the outcomes were than what actually happened. If we have a bit more of a look at descriptive research, we can see that it seeks to describe phenomena rather than manipulate variables. So methods of descriptive research are things like case studies. So it might look at a single person in a lot of detail. So if we look at this example here, we've got a hat. We might examine the hat, we might examine the shoes, we might examine the pants and the shirt, and how that describes an individual. So how do those things make up a specific or describe an individual person? That's sort of what case studies do. They look at something or an individual in a lot of detail. It's not very generalizable, but it can be good to describe very rare cases or where we can't get a lot of participants. If we look at something in a little bit more detail than we could if we looked at a general sample or bigger sample. We've got naturalistic observation. So this is looking at people in their natural habitat or animals within their natural habitat and see how they behave within that. And then we've got survey research, which is very common within social psychology, where we send out surveys and collect lots of data from lots of people, and it's a little bit more generalizable, and we can make a few more conclusions from that are more representative of the population. So case studies, like I said, is an in-depth study of the behavior of one person or a small group. Freud used a lot in clinical research. It's used when large numbers of participants are not available. One of the drawbacks is that it has small sample size, very susceptible to researcher bias, and problem of an atypical case. The small sample obviously limits its generalizability to the population, and researcher bias is where the researcher often sees what they want to see. So in the case study, in observing an individual with a specific psychological disorder, you might look for things and observe them because you want to see them rather than because they were there. But that doesn't mean it's not useful. In fact, psychologists are evidence-based practitioners. Each client should be considered a case study. In a clinical setting, it can be very useful to gain insight or in-depth information about your client, and you can take things like baseline measures and then look at it following an intervention for that individual to see if the treatment is effective for that individual. That's where case studies can be really helpful. Naturalistic observation refers to an in-depth study of a phenomenon in its natural setting. So psychologists find naturalistic observation a useful tool in practice. So for example, if a child is having difficulty in school, it is probably advantageous to observe the child in the school environment to obtain first-hand view of the problems. So that's where it can be helpful. It's used a lot in primate studies, looking at their behaviour in the wild. Piaget also used it looking at cognitive development of his own children. Naturalistic observation tends to have good generalizability. However, a disadvantage is that we can't establish the cause of the behaviour because by observing the behaviour, we might alter their behaviour. So if people know, if you know you're being watched, you might behave differently. A bit of a case of Schrodinger's cat is it dead or alive, and observation can alter. So survey research is a technique where we send out questionnaires to large numbers of people to gain information on their attitudes and behaviours. A disadvantage of this is obviously something called social desirability bias, where people tend to inaccurately respond to the questionnaires because they respond in a way that they think they should rather than the way they feel. And that is a problem in survey research, that we might get biased results because of it. Selecting a sample then is very important for survey research. For example, in polling for voter exit polls, interviews must be sure that the sample reflects a large and heterogeneous population if they are to predict election results accurately. We saw that in America, where the polling results, perhaps some social desirability bias in there as well, where all the polls were showing that the Democrats should win by a landslide against Trump. But obviously the outcome was very different. So the polling wasn't reflecting the population, or was that in the polling people had a social desirability bias where they weren't willing to socially tell the truth or about how they actually felt or wanted to behave. So what we want in survey research then is a random sample. So a sample selected from the general population in a relatively arbitrary way that does not introduce any systematic bias. So in random sampling, every member of a population should have an equal chance of being selected for the sample. So if we are in the Faculty of Sciences, for example, that is our population. So we have 1,000 people in our population, and it's in our stratified population we have 400 psychology, 300 nursing, 100 maths, biology, and so on. So if we want a proportional sample, we'd want a proportion that is equal to our stratified population. So 80, 60, 20, 40. Or we can have a disproportional sample where we have equal numbers from each of those samples. Depending on what you want to do on your research question and how you want to go about it, you have to decide which one is more appropriate to the general population. We're specifically looking at our population Faculty of Sciences, then the proportional stratified sample is probably more accurate and generalizable than the disproportional. Next, we're looking at correlational research. So the aim of this type of research is to determine the degree to which two or more variables are related. So an important distinction is that correlational research cannot determine causality. So a relationship between two variables does not mean one causes the other. If we look at something like weight is correlated with height, the taller you are, the more you're likely to weigh, but that does not necessarily mean tall people are going to weigh more. There's other factors that contribute to weight. So a correlational coefficient is the statistic that we use to measure the extent that two variables are related. So the correlation coefficient, which is represented by a little r, the values range from -1 to 0 and all the way up to +1. So a negative correlation, which is a negative value, means that high values of one variable are associated with low values of another variable. And positive correlations are that high values on one variable are associated with high values on another. A negative correlation, so if it ranges from 0 to -1, or a positive correlation if it ranges from 0 to +1. The closer the correlation coefficient is to -1 or +1, the stronger that correlation is. The positive or negative just refers to the direction of that relationship. So if you look on the screen here, we've got positive correlation. So here we've got positive correlation, and we can see here that as weight increases, so this is weight, as this goes up and height goes up, we can see here that there's that relationship. So the taller you are, typically the more you weigh. And you can see here that the dots are spread out a little bit. So a perfect correlation would look like this. We'd have the dots directly on the line. So you can see here that there's not the value for the correlation wouldn't be 1, be something like 0.6 maybe, or 0.7. And this example, we've got a negative correlation, so you can see it goes this way. So you can see that the negative correlation, that the higher your socioeconomic status, the lower the dropout rate from high school is. Here we have a 0 correlation. So you can see here that you can't really see any pattern. You can draw a line through it anywhere and it will look the same. So there's no relationship between intelligence and interpersonal trust. This is just one of the examples I mentioned before, that correlation doesn't mean causation, and that there can be other factors that are contributing to that relationship. So this is a website that a researcher has put together. The link is on the slides, and it's just called Spurious Correlations. You can see here that there is a relationship between the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool and the films Nicolas Cage appeared in. Now, these two variables are completely unrelated, yet they correlate. So it's possible that highly possible that something else is contributing to that, and that these two things are just completely unrelated at all. But for some reason, they've got a correlation between them. The last thing we'll look at here is the internet and psychological research. So just as internet technologies are changing all aspects of our life, so too are they impacting on the way psychology research takes place. So in many ways, the opportunities that these technologies open up are extremely exciting, but just as in wider society, there are also some challenges that need to be considered as we adapt to the online universe. So we talked about experimental research before, and the importance of controlling variables and manipulating. Another important factor is we need to control the environment that we conduct experiments in. So if you look at something like physics, it's conducted in a test tube essentially. And in psychology, we want to control that as much as we can. So that's why we typically run experimental research in a lab. So if we start conducting these research studies on the internet, there's a whole range of things that we're not controlling. We don't know the setting that the person's participating in. Are they doing it on a bus? Are they doing it in a public area where there's influence of noise and people talking and all those sort of things? So how do we overcome those challenges? Some positive impacts though is that online sources are quick and easy. We have good access to information now. Very easy to look up literature, things like Google Scholar for the general public as well. We can recruit wider. So if we're looking at survey research, it's much easier now to recruit using things like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey. You can get a wide range of people participating. It also makes data entry so much easier. It's automatic. You can just export straight into whatever statistical program you want to use. And like I mentioned, negative impacts. So validity of information, is it as valid now that we're looking at it? Can we control the variables? We're getting skewed samples, so certain types of people are responding. There's ethical considerations as well, and like I said, no controlled environment.